Today I'll be asking Professor Nora Crook a few questions about her personal views on Shelley. Professor Crook is Emeritus Professor at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. Her extensive work on both Percy and Mary Shelley has established her reputation as one of the principal Shelley experts of our age. She has spoken at the 2017 conference about Mary Shelley's role as Percy B. Shelley's editor, a torch that she carries herself as a co-general editor of the complete poetry of Percy B. Shelley, of which Volume 7 has recently been published. She had a special responsibility for poems edited by Mary Shelley after Percy's death. What was your first impression of Shelley, and was there a particular poem or factor that sparked your interest?
I became aware of Shelley from a production called The Children's Encyclopedia, edited by Arthur Mee, and it was 1920 edition, and it had belonged to my father and was old-fashioned even in those days. But between the ages of 7 and 10, it taught me virtually everything that I knew about the world outside my native Jamaica. And it didn't have anything to say about Jamaica, which was par for the course, but it did have a lot to say about other things. And among the articles in it was one called Great Poets Since the Death of Milton. And it had a section which was headed The Stormy Life and Tragic Death of the Poet Shelley. And this is how it went. And there was a picture of Shelley. And it went like this. Shelley was a fair and beautiful youth, perhaps less manly in appearance than Byron. Shelley, like so many of the young men of his day, had imbibed revolutionary ideas as a result of the Great Revolution in France, and with these was united in him revolt against the teaching of Christianity. The result was an ill-ordered and unrestful life, for though his poetic genius greatly enriched our English literature, with such fine works as Prometheus Unbound, Adonais, and the Ode to the West Wind, we cannot help feeling that his life was unhappy and his end tragic. He was drowned off the coast of Italy on July the 8th, 1822. His body was washed ashore near Via Reggio, and it was cremated in the presence of some friends, etc., etc. Next came John Keats, another great poet whose sun went down too soon, towards whom the Children's Encyclopedia was definitely more less censorious. Anyway, both of them were very interesting. And as I was a rather self-dramatizing kind of kid and fully expected that my life was going to be stormy and tragic as well, I was naturally a bit drawn towards Shelley, but I never came to have a true fellow feeling for him until I much later found that he had been bullied at school. And then I did feel that a certain affinity with him. But biography almost had nothing to do with my experience of reading his poetry. I only really read a proper biography when I was nearly 40 and came across, as so many do, Richard Holmes's biography. But even now, the biography of Shelley and the reading the poetry don't quite mesh as experiences, because they came from different ways. But that was my first experience. Shelley was a beautiful youth who had a tragic and stormy life.
So what is your favorite Shelley poem and why?
Well, the poem that sparked my interest in the first place, really grabbed me, first one, was The Sensitive Plant. And that came in a little limp leather-bound selections from Shelley that my father had given my mother as a courtship present. And it made a very powerful impression on me. And I still have this little limp book. And it's the first poem in the selection. And I went and opened it and read with mounting delight of this beautiful garden that is created. And then with horror, as the garden gets fouler and fouler, as the lady who is its tutelary genius of the place dies. and spawn weeds and filth, leprous scum covers it, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And then winter comes, and the garden is all covered with frost and is totally dead. And then, when spring comes, things do not revive again. They just keep on getting worse. And I remember reading this with appalled horror. And then at the very end, Shelley springs a surprise, which is to say that the garden is not really dead. It still exists there because beauty can never die. And I remember feeling that there was something wrong and unsatisfying about this. Because children are terrible conservatives. If there's a beautiful cake, say, they don't even want a slice cut out of it. They won't eat it. They also want it to be just as perfect as it was before. So this was a sort of unreasonable idea to get back the garden as it was. And I realized that the only way I could do this was to start reading the poem all over again. And then it bloomed once more. But of course, I did it in the foreknowledge that it was inevitably going to be destroyed again, but it could always be recreated. And I think, although of course I didn't articulate this, I couldn't have formed these ideas. It was all experiential. Not then, not when I was 10. I think that Sensitive Plant taught me an awful lot about the experience of rereading, and how it's not the same as the first reading, and also about how art does preserve, and you can get back to how things were through art, because it is repeatable in that way. So yeah, that's really the first poem that truly impacted on me of Shelley.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's a lovely story. And also another point that I was thinking as you were describing it is the beauty that Shelley sees also immutability, because again, it's never going to go back to what it was before, but the beauty doesn't fade. So it's a nice way to look at it as well. But yeah, revisiting a poem, and it is an interesting one to start with as well. I don't find that this is the first impression that people have with Shelley, so it's really nice to hear that, and also in a very young age.
Well, I think the thing is that there's a very simple Shelley. He is, of course, immensely sophisticated and learned, but there is a side of Shelley which is very direct, and which even a child can understand, or not necessarily everything, but a child who can, can get the point. And I think later on, when we come on to the question, the popularity of Shelley, when we come on to that subject, I think I think the same is true of Ozymandias, that you can get it even though you can't understand or work through all the syntax, and that seems to me to be a very a great peculiarity of Shelley, that this way in which he can be very complex and difficult, but also there is something extremely clear at the center of what he does.
Which one would be your favorite poem by Shelley?
Yes, the favorite isn't necessarily the first one that had the impact, and it's got to me to be Ode to the West Wind, and that really came to me quite a few years later when I was 14, and again it had something to do with circumstances, as so many poems that are very meaningful to one do. And in this particular case, a polio epidemic had gripped Jamaica's first polio epidemic, really. And we had been whisked away from the pestilence-stricken multitudes in Kingston, the capital city, where several of my friends died, in fact. And we're taken to the countryside and to the seaside. And I remember, because it was autumn, well, in as much as Jamaica has an autumn, and it was the time of the rains and the northerly winds, which lashed the shore and flung up great waves, and it was a stormy season. And I remember walking along the beach, shouting "Ode to the West Wind" at the waves, and masses of seaweeds and jellyfish littering the the sand. And at other times, you'd have sudden calms with blue skies of heaven above, you know. And I can only use Shelleyan language. The poem answered to the state of my soul. You know, the adolescent ferment had just kicked in at 14. And but it is also a poem I've found for the agitations and furies and of old age, and it speaks to the wish always to be able to be recreated again. And it's also a poem of such technical brilliance. It seems to be just an effusion, but of course it is extremely tightly structured, and it's beautifully made. And that's, yeah, it's got to be Ode to the West Wind for me.
So is there a piece of information or event that you uncover throughout your career that impacted you the most?
Well, if you're thinking of a single thing, I guess that the chance discovery through the internet that I made of 13 letters of Mary Shelley back in, I think it was 2013, at the Essex Record Office, would be the sort of thing that impacted most on my reputation. And it was good timing because it was early in January and there was no news in particular that particular week. Newspapers were after something, little snippety news item, and it went around the world, and people still come to me, oh, you're the one who found the letters of Mary Shelley, which was nice. So I have my 15 minutes of fame from that. But I you know, that's Mary Shelley, not Shelley. So maybe that doesn't count. But I wouldn't say that I have made that there's any single great discovery. You know, they're sort of little discoveries, like, for instance, there's a line about vampire bats in The Triumph of Life. Vampire bats shutting out the glare of the tropical sun at noonday. Where did Shelley get the idea that vampire bats shut out the glare of the tropical sun at noonday? Did he, you know, is this him making it up, or is this Trelawney yarning about it? And I discovered, well, he went. There's a catalogue of an exhibition of. It was called Bullock's Museum, and Shelley visited it in, I think, 1814 or 1815 with Mary. And it had all sorts of curiosities. And in the catalogue, it says that vampire bats are so numerous in Madagascar that they shut out the glare of the noonday sun. And he just had this in his mind, and it comes out in the very last poem of his long poem of his life, The Triumph of Life, this memory. And he went there, and apparently they had a display of bats sort of stuck in imitation trees and things. It sounds like absolutely ghastly exhibition and grotesque. And of course, and it's there in Triumph of Life. So I wouldn't say that's a great discovery, but if you, lots of little ones like this, and I think Shelley editors all make their little finds of this sort, you know? But that's not what that's not what you really mean, is it?
It doesn't sound that little. I'm always intrigued by things that make Shelley a man. So experience like this, like maybe an exhibition that he saw that inspired him in his poems, or something that he saw that definitely didn't inspire him, but little things that people do on a daily basis. Because I always find that in history, people tend to forget that those names were real people with real habits. So I'm always really intrigued by those little details and things that they did on a daily basis, or little events in their lives. So I don't think it's that much of a little discovery. I think it's a really good one.
But I think the thing is that truth to fact doesn't explain the enormous power of the metaphor as it appears in the poem. I mean, you can trace this back to a fact that happened in Shelley's life, but it can't explain the thing that brings it together with all other sorts of things to create this enormously powerful impression that one gets from it. But it's interesting. You know?
Oh, yeah, it's really interesting. And I guess that the real impact it had on him is on his poetical mind. So it's part of who he is.
Yes, and memory is part of Shelley, and bringing memories that may have happened, things that happened a very long time ago, I think is part of his makeup. But there is something that that is in train of happening, and this is something that's going to go up on romantic circles, and is made possible through the generosity of the Pforzheimer collection. But it's really work that I have helped to complete, that was started by the Pforzheimer, and has a very great many hands working on it. But but I've sort of got it together and put it into a form, and there's quite a lot of stuff that has to be put onto it because it's going to be an electronic, an online text. But it is a list of books that Shelley left behind him in England when he in Marlow, and it's about 300 titles, and there's a very interesting story attached to what became of these books. And there are some truly surprising items on it, as well as ones that confirm what people know already or what they hope to find. It's a mix of all of various different kinds of things. And I think there are quite a few titles on it which were of books that Mary Shelley owned, and which the Shelleys obviously had in common. I think it is going to be an interesting resource. So I hope that will have an impact on Shelley studies in the years to come.
When we're talking about the second generation of romantics, Byron and Keats are certainly the more popular ones in a mainstream kind of way. But do you think that Shelley's popularity is growing or has grown in the recent years according to our current political climate?
That's a hard one. I'd say in the world of academia, I think there's some brilliant young scholars coming up working on Shelley, or both of the Shelleys, and whose work is going to have a terrific impact on an effect on students to come. But you're really talking about Shelley's popular impact beyond academia, and that's a hard one to answer because I'm retired. I'm working on the editor. I do not feel I have my finger on the pulses of what is going on in people whom I used to be more in contact with. I think the person to ask about this is Graham Henderson, whose website really is working out and reaching people outside academia. But I think we could make a few remarks about this, or ask some questions. Things I don't know are people still putting up graffiti from Prometheus Unbound, such as one saw in the 1970s and 80s? Kelvin Everest, in that interview that you have of him, spoke of having been to the concert with Mick Jagger, where Mick Jagger quotes from Adonais. Could that happen today? Do Shelleyan lines come into pop songs, rock music, rock lyrics? Well, Jeremy Corbyn quoted "Rise like lions after slumber," and that is known. But I think I would locate Shelley's popular appeal and the sort of quality of where lines from him are passed around from mouth to mouth and people don't know where they come from, but it's just part of their environment, in Ozymandias, which I spoke of earlier on. And it's a poem like Tiger, Tiger Burning Bright, that you can, you take away the line from it. If you say Tiger, Tiger Burning Bright in the forest of the night to a child who just likes the sound of words will probably remember it. And the same with "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings." It just sounds a wonderful, mouth-filling, vainglorious boast. It sounds weird and wonderful. And, you know, I've heard children intone it just on hearing it. But I think you'll also find on the internet plenty of material in which people say, my favorite poem is Ozymandias, and wanting to share it. And there's, for instance, one I found was, you know, a young man who was saying, was writing about why he likes Ozymandias so much. And he says, the poem's message is that eventually things such as greed and power eventually will cease to exist, and that negative things don't last in life. However, a sense of unity and community is what gives people hope and the power to achieve the unexpected. Just like the English football team, led by an uninspiring, boring, so-called Gareth Southgate, the team overcame all expectations set by the media and the public and brought a sense of unity, hope, and happiness throughout the country. Now, this is someone who is, you know, he's relating Ozymandias and what Ozymandias stands for to his antithesis, and the antithesis is Gareth Southgate and the English team. And Ozymandias is everything that isn't community, collective feeling and bringing people together. And that's what, you know, Ozymandias means to him. That's how it's transformed into the substance of his life and his values. And I think that is something about how Shelley works. When people take Shelleyan views and translate them into their experience and their values, and it does happen, I think, with Ozymandias. And so probably in ways that people don't even know it's Shelley, that Shelley keeps on like a kind of hidden yeast fermenting and there in the British consciousness and continuing to work.
So we have one last question. At the Shelley Conference 2017, you spoke about Mary Shelley's role as an editor. This year we have celebrated the launch of Volume 7 of the Complete Poetry of Percy B. Shelley. Can you describe your experience as an editor, assuming the role that Mary Shelley had almost 200 years ago?
Well, there's something about the thrill of handling a manuscript that's not like anything else, and particularly a manuscript where you can see, because it's written with pen and ink and not with not with a computer, you can see every mark that's been made. You can see the where things are going smoothly and everything is flowing. You can see where the pen is giving trouble and where there's impatience, where Shelley has begun to draw little doodles and test his pen and scratch things in the paper and things like that. And it's it's very enigmatic what some of these pictures mean. A lot of people have read things into them, but what you can't get rid of the sense you're touching the same paper that somebody wrote on nearly 200 years ago. You're seeing them, the outward and visible signs of their creativity at work. And I don't think I ever stopped being thrilled at that. And I even found when I was handling the manuscripts, little tiny grains of sand where Shelley had blotted things, and they used sand instead of blotting paper. There's still little bits of sand in the notebooks. And the places where Shelley had made a big blob with ink and he'd wiped it through with a feather and drawn a little picture of a tree with the feather that he had wiped it with. Just what one might do oneself. And there's that sense of immediacy in that. But I served my apprenticeship actually not editing, but transcribing. And I remember going through something like, I went through the poem he wrote on the death of Napoleon. And as a result of just transcribing his draft, I began to understand what that poem was about. And it was something about slowing myself down to the same pace that Shelley was taking of writing it through, that again gave some sort of insight, which is hard to explain. But in that poem, Shelley rings the changes on words gold, blood, cold, and the idea of the earth bringing forth Napoleon and then devouring him, feeding on what it fed. Napoleon has destroyed the hopes of the world. He is being taken back to the earth, to his earth, his mother, who will in turn devour him. And as I wrote these words, as Shelley tries out these words again and again and again, a deep feeling of almost despair came over me, and of deep gloom, as if just writing out these words created the mood, which I hadn't gone in doing it at all. Somehow, I got the feeling that I understood better what it cost Shelley to write that poem. And writing out a poem is a discipline which can sometimes bring insights, and particularly from writing out a manuscript. And that is, I suppose, a function of editing. I think it was a very good apprenticeship for me. And I had this, as I say, tremendous sense of weariness and woe after this. Extraordinary. But to return to what you said about Mary Shelley, of course, no one really can fill Mary Shelley's shoes or assume her role. And she did it, as far as is known, all by herself. Now, there are more women working on editing Shelley than ever there have been, I think, all at once. And I'm thinking of Martha Linda Nabagubi and Carleen Adamson and of Valentina Balinelli, and of women who have done so in the past. I think of Judith Chernak, the creator of Poems on the Underground. And that, in fact, if you go back, you find that there were always women who have been involved in editing Shelley, but there never has been another Mary Shelley, and there can't be, of course. And the impression I have taken away most of all from the experience is that what she did single-handedly, almost without any help, I have done in the presence of immense help and support from really from all my colleagues and fellow editors. My colleague Neil Freistad, mentors, Donald Ryman, Michael O'Neill, so sadly not with us again. Kelvin paid tribute to him in his interview. Bruce Barker Benfield, a curator, a really amazing curator of Shelley's manuscripts, and my colleagues at in the Longmans edition, who have been incredibly generous and as well as being very, very fine editors themselves, wonderful editors. I'm thinking of Kelvin himself and also of Mike Rossington. She did it alone. I have been privileged to be part of the community of Shelley scholars and editors. And this is something that links the past with the present and with the future.
Thank you very much for answering all of our questions, and thank you everybody for watching it. And please make sure to check out our previous video where we interview Professor Kelvin Everest. And again, as we mentioned, all the links will be in the description of this video below, and keep your eyes out for future events. And thank you very much.